This week we're going to finally dig into the nature of what strategy is and look at some of the different perspectives that have been presented on the strategic process and look at what this means for justice professionals, particularly for young justice professionals operating in their everyday life. Now, when I set about designing this unit, I had this sort of hope that I'd be able to find in all the vast literature on business strategy some really good hints and tips, sort of information on when you're going about strategy, these are the sort of things that you do. And it was quite interesting to find out that almost everything that's written in this field is descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's about the way that strategy is made. It's about the sorts of organizational units and formations that implement strategy, and there's very little of it that's actually about the actual what you do when you do strategy. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure you'll share my disappointment at some level, but it's also quite interesting to look at what has been written to save you having to go and do a business degree to learn about all of this. And the book I used extensively in this, I found was very useful, was one called Strategy Safari, which was a really good overview of that business literature, business research around strategy making. So yeah, unfortunately, I'd kind of hoped today there would have been a lot of sort of good guides to how to go about doing strategy, and maybe someone will write those at some point. There's certainly a lot of, I guess, popular writing, the kinds of books you see around in airport bookshops of, you know, how to be a great entrepreneur and how to be a business leader sort of stuff. And honestly, they're pretty much all trash. And most of them are sort of platitudes of, you know, what people in business think it is to be a leader. So I really couldn't recommend any of those. But at least this gives us a starting of understanding how strategy is made, even if it doesn't give us a much of a helping hand on how to do it. I want to start, though, by talking about what strategy can be and what it's not, because I think it's one of those terms that's used quite badly quite often in organisations, and it's one that it's worth thinking about the diverse aspects to it. So I mentioned these in section 1 of the reading materials, which I will link below for people who aren't CQU students who might be watching this. And strategy can include a lot of things. It can just be about good ideas. When we talk about good strategy, we could just be talking about ideas. It could be a fancy way of talking about that. But strategy can also have a meta component. It can be about the way that we obtain ideas, how we sort them, and how we prioritize them. So it can also be about that process around idea generation. It can simply mean having a rational plan before you go about doing something, which, you know, in some areas is surprising how often that doesn't happen. It could refer to the idea of tricks and deception. When we talk about being strategic about something, we are being deceptive and we're playing a game with systems. It can also involve a sort of pattern recognition, where you can look at things over time and plan around patterns. And there's a sort of a longitudinal sort of strategy, which is about just knowing if something's going up, it's going to come down, and it's going down, it's going to come up again, and being able to plan around those things. It could also relate to problem solving. So not necessarily managing things ahead before they occur, but after they occur, using strategy to solve problems, either as individuals or as groups. It can apply to a particular perspective. Being strategic can be the way in which you look at issues, and it can also be the Batman approach to strategy, where you have a gadget and a backup gadget for every eventuality. Being strategic can also refer to a kind of way of responding to risk, where you've always got a plan, a backup plan, and a backup plan behind your backup plan. So all these things are different ways of thinking about that word strategy. So it encompasses a whole lot of different things. But there's also a couple of things that it's used for quite wrongly. in organisations that I wanted to point out. The first is just following what you've done in the past or what's been laid out previously. So saying, we're following the business strategy that was laid down for us, 20 years ago by our business founders. That's not being strategic. Strategic's an active thing. It's not strategy is an active thing, not a passive thing. Another very common misuse of strategy is creating mission and vision statements. Dear God. And I'm sure some of you have been through this process where you have, a retreat, and no one's doing your work while you're away, so you're going to have to do it when you get back the next day. And there's facilitators who break out the butcher's paper and coloured pens and plasticine and rainbow stickers and everything else and say, let's be creative about our mission and vision statement. And at the end of the day, you end up with this statement that's written by a committee that just basically says what you already knew. I don't know where that particular form of strategy making came from, but it's quite terrible, and it alienates everyone, and it doesn't do any good. But it seems to be quite popular. Every workplace I've been in the last 10 years or so has had these days where you get out there and quibble about words in your mission and vision statement and kind of then ignore the broader strategic things that are going on. And I know, speaking to some students about this unit, that they've, said, I'm not looking forward to that one. And you ask them why, and they say, we had a company retreat where we did strategy, and it was like the worst thing ever. And hopefully, I'm hoping that this unit hasn't been the worst thing ever. I'm hoping it's something you find interesting. But I understand that if the way this sort of fake strategy is done, but, it's not good enough. And the other, I think, way in which strategy is used badly is this idea that it's a kind of a set of cheats or a playbook that you can go, we've got a strategy, and this strategy will find a way of, cheating the system or getting rich quick or avoiding problems altogether. And I see this a bit in the gaming world. Forgive me for a brief tangent, but when you've got evolving games like MMOs, like World of Warcraft or Elder Scrolls, which I play, people are always producing ideal builds for characters and gear build outs for your equipment, and you've got to do this and you've got to do this and you've got to do this. And there's this whole meta play around a game as to how, what is the best approach to play the game. And most of these games are so complicated, there are heaps of different ways you can approach it. But there's this obsession with being, what is the prime build in the meta at the moment? What is the way to play the game? And I think that's a broader flaw in strategic thinking that we also see in organisational strategies, where people are looking for strategy as, this kind of guaranteed easy path through a set of problems, whereas in reality, strategy is about thinking diversely, creatively, coming up with heaps of different options and being able to respond to change, not following the playbook of how to do things. And maybe that's why, I mentioned just before the disappointment of not having, the big book of strategy that will tell you everything you need to know about strategy. And maybe that's why it's impossible, because it's impossible. They don't exist because it's impossible to do. I did find in my search the Ferengi rules of acquisition, which if you're a Star Trek fan, you'll know. And if you don't know, don't worry about it. But it's a kind of a satirical strategy guide for maximising profit. And minimising empathy. But yeah, there were a few things like that I found, and a few non-satirical things that were almost the same, but there isn't really a sense of which there is any good strategy playbooks, and maybe that's because it's a thing that's redundant to want, because part of strategy is establishing your own plays and playbooks. Anyway, I'm going to keep looking, I'm going to keep searching, and one of these days I may find some useful things to recommend. But I do think it's interesting that in the business field there's no particular specific set of rules. And definitely in the public sector, in the justice field, it's the same. So this is probably one of the chunkier of the guides this week, the learning modules. But I've gone through and I've summarised each of the different historical schools of strategy in business and provided a little bit of an application for each of them to how it applies into the justice sector. So we get that context, because obviously there are different demands and different parameters for people who are working in criminal justice and other areas of the justice sector. I'm not going to go through them again now. I think that will probably be quite tedious, and I'm up to 10 minutes already, I notice. But they are interesting in that they're historical, and they start sort of in the 1940s and 1950s, and they move through different historical periods and show us different ways that we have thought about organisations and how organisations function. And another thing that's very interesting is that I think it's the planning school, which is sort of the second model of strategy and entrepreneurship, is the one that most organisations seem to be stuck in. Certainly universities are stuck in. So it is interesting that a lot of the world is still pretty much stuck in the 1950s approach to strategy and organisation building. And there's a lot more in there that has passed since then. And then you start thinking, there's issues of, well, why are we so stuck in the past? Why has all this research and all this literature on strategy not made much of an impact? And one of the reasons is strategic theory has changed dramatically in its approach to hierarchies. The first two schools, the design school and the planning school, were very, very much enmeshed in hierarchical organisations. The design school was very much about the entrepreneur, the businessman, gendered as it was of the day, as the brilliant messianic figure in the Western world whose fantastic ideas and strategies would take business to the next level. I know it's slightly out of time, but I always think of Mad Men in terms of this sort of model of organisations where you've got, men in nice suits and everyone's smoking and having liquid lunches and everything else. The planning school that followed broadened that idea, but basically turned strategy into a bureaucratic process. It wasn't just the one leader. It became this hierarchy within the organisation, that you had a strategy group that built strategy and did SWOT analyses and did this and whatever, and then laid down all that strategy through the rest of the organisation. And I think that's why we kind of stopped there in many organisations. I know universities have kind of stopped there, because people who think in hierarchical ways like those models. They don't like the models that followed, because it decenters strategy and it looks at how strategy is an organisational wide thing. And people who are bosses like to continue to be bosses. So again, a lot of organisations that have this very fixed idea of hierarchy, where people put a lot of value in having a title and being, at the top of the pyramid above everyone else, very resistant to new ways of thinking about strategy. So moving forward in time, we get the positioning school that follows on, and that's really looking at strategy as a form of analysis that can occur throughout an organisation. There's the cognitive school that looks at decision making and uses a lot of cognitive psychology, and builds that into saying, well, it doesn't matter if you're making decisions as the president of a company or the person who's handling customer inquiries, wherever you are in the hierarchy. Strategy is about decision making. So let's look at the way in which people make decisions, and let's understand that better and find better ways to make those decisions. The learning school goes even more broadly and looks at strategy as an organisational capacity, and talks about why are some organisations good at strategy, why are others not so good, and the ones that are good at strategy are the ones that are learning organisations, that are very good at handling information and knowledge and learning from it, in innovating, trying new things, learning, iterating and coming back again. Similarly, the Power School does what a lot of the other schools have been reluctant to do, and looked at the role of power in strategic decision making. And there's heaps of others that mentioned there: configuration school, cultural school, environmental school. But all the more modern models of strategy take that bigger organizational kind of approach and are very interested in strategy as being something that occurs everywhere. And I think that's something that you can get out of this that's very interesting when you flip through those. And as I said, I'm not going to go through all of them in a video, because it's going to be quicker for you just to read it and you're going to absorb more of it. All right, now the reading this week, there's a guide to the reading. It's a reading on problem-oriented policing as an approach, and the way it was attempted to be used in the United Kingdom, and it failed. And I think it's a very interesting example of what we've just been talking about, because it was an attempt to bring in a more diverse notion of strategy to an organisation that was extremely hierarchical. It's a very good model of policing. It's basically about being proactive and doing things before there's a crisis rather than simply responding to crisis. But the problem with this is it involves a lot of decision making and a lot of input from people who are at the, inverted commas, bottom level of the organisation. A lot of the people who are the officers who are on the street who see things, having them able to report those and take action on things ahead of time and see things that occur. And the British police were so hierarchical, they hated it. The people who are at the top of the tree were like, why should I be listening to these mere peasants down the bottom of the tree? I'm the commissioner of policing, or I'm the chief superintendent. I'm more important than these people. And the strategy, the attempt to take a new strategic approach failed because of that. Not because it was a bad strategy, but because the people at the top loved their hierarchies so much. And the article makes a good argument that it's time to reconsider and revisit that. And when you have a look at some of the woes that the UK police and our police have been going through, a lot of them are failures of organisation and management, and are things that a broader strategic approach would have avoided, rather than this constant media spin, risk management or catastrophe management that most police bureaucracies seem to be mired in at the moment. We're always hearing about scandals and this happening and that happening and what's the response of the police, and we very rarely hear much about what the future planning process is about. And I think that's a terrible wasted opportunity, and emblematic of what we're doing in this unit in terms of thinking about how getting a new generation of strategic thinkers across the justice sector is an important thing to do. So I'll leave you on that thought. We've got an interesting, hope it's interesting, workshop this week, challenge around the rise of neo-fascist groups and how you deal with those in a way that's strategic. Do you wait till you have Nazis doing Nazi salutes outside Parliament House, or do you try and generate strategies to avoid those people becoming powerful and becoming, appealing in whatever their appeal is in the community? Are there better ways to approach issues like violent reactionary fascism than just sort of waiting for it to happen and then trying to react to it? All right, so that's that for this week, and I'll see you in the workshops, hopefully.